Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I am Miguel del Valle. On behalf of our board members, I want to thank you for being here today, this evening. The purpose of this hearing is to comply with the school code provisions regarding the FY20 amended budget. Madam Secretary, please state for the record the notice procedure for this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. President. Notice of this public hearing was published in the Chicago Sun-Times, a newspaper of general circulation in the city of Chicago, and posted at the boardroom, principal office, and 42 West Madison Street lobby on November 6, 2019. Notice was also posted on the cpsboe.org website on November 6, 2019, and I will now read into the record the public notice as published. Notice public hearings FY20 amended budget for the 2019-2020 fiscal year, Chicago Board of Education, commonly known as Chicago Public Schools, to whom it may concern. Public notice is hereby given by the Chicago Board of Education that it has prepared an FY20 amended budget for the 2019-2020 fiscal year in tentative form, and that 5 copies thereof available for public inspection have been filed and are now on file in the office of the Board of Education of the City of Chicago, commonly known as Chicago Public Schools, 1 North Dearborn Street, Suite 950, Chicago, Illinois, 60602, and available at www.cps.edu/budget, and that said Board of Education will hold 2 public hearings upon said amended budget on the 12th day of November 2019. Chicago Public Schools Loop Office, 42 West Madison Street, Garden Level Boardroom, Chicago, Illinois, 60602. The first hearing time was from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. with registration taking place from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. And the second hearing, Chicago Public Schools Loop Office, 42 West Madison Street, Garden Level Boardroom, Chicago, Illinois, 60602, with the hearing time 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. and registration 5:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. Dated at Chicago, Illinois, November 6, 2019, Chicago Board of Education, by Miguel del Valle, President, and attested by Estela G. Beltran, the Board Secretary. And Mr. President, I would like to also note for the record the members that are present here today with us. We have Board Member Rome. Here. We have Vice President Rivaluri. Here. We have Board Member Elizabeth Todd Breland. Here. Member Truss.
Here.
And Member Sotelo.
Here.
And Board President Del Valle.
Here.
We have 6 members present. There is a quorum, and I would also like to recognize Joseph Moriarty, our General Counsel, Latanya McDade, our Chief Education Officer, and Arnie Rivera, our Chief Operating Officer. Thank you.
Thank you. We will begin the FY20 amended budget presentation, and presenting this evening is Michael Sitkowski. Please proceed.
Thank you, President Del Valle. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm going to give you a presentation on the FY 2020 amended budget. To start, a recap of the FY 2020 budget approved in August. So this original budget approved at the August 28th board meeting included $6.2 billion of operating expenses and a total budget of $7.7 billion. The budget included major investments to support the district's key initiatives, including critical building improvements for more than 300 schools across the city, and the largest ever capital investment for pre-K classrooms, the largest ever expansion of high-quality academic programs, $10 million to support the first year of the district's multi-year commitment to hire additional nurses, social workers, and case managers, and $12 million to support English learners at more than 100 schools. It's important to note that all of these items and everything that was included in the initial budget is also included in the FY 2020 amended budget that we're presenting tonight. The original FY 2020 budget also included assumptions on costs associated with labor agreements with the Chicago Teachers Union and the Service Employees International Union, CTU and SEIU, which were still under negotiation at the time. Since we passed the budget in August, we've reached tentative agreements with CTU and SEIU, and I want to give a high-level overview of where those agreements landed. The term of both agreements was 5 years. The base compensation increases are 16% in cost of living adjustments across the 5 years. This includes a 3% cost of living adjustment in FY 2020, a half percentage point higher than we had included in the original budget approved in August. In addition to compensation, we have some staffing increases built into the agreements. Some of these were previously announced in July, these being the social workers, nurses, and case managers. In addition to those commitments that we made in July, we added 60 case managers to our previous commitment. Over and above those, we've included in the contract are 120 equity positions that will support our highest need schools. Could give them a counselor, a restorative justice coordinator, or a librarian, or an additional position that will be decided on by the school community. We've lowered the threshold for a full-time centrally funded English learner program teacher from 200 EL students to 150. We've created a new position called a school community representative that will support our schools with the highest number of students in temporary living situations. And we've also committed to maintain at least current clinician staffing levels. On top of that, we've committed to $35 million annually to support reduced class size beginning in FY21. We've committed to $5 million annually to support sports programming, also beginning in FY21. We've committed to $5 million annually over the 5 years of the contract for veteran teachers. We've restructured the wage scales for CTU and SEIU for our support staff to help recruit and retain employees. And then we've also invested in pipeline and tuition reimbursement programs. So with the agreement, we're here to present the amended budget tonight. I'm going to give you an overview of the material changes that are included in this budget. Related to the contracts, the tentative agreements with the CTU and SEIU, we have $48 million in additional expense for FY 2020. There's a $68 million reduced expense due to instructional days lost to the work stoppage. There's a $60 million reduction in revenue due to the loss of the city subsidy for support staff pension costs, which we'll get into in a bit more detail later. We have an additional $66 million in increased TIF surplus funding. This is over and above the $97 million that was included in the budget approved in August. And on top of that, we have $26 million in reduced short-term borrowing included in the FY 2020 amended budget. A bit more detail on the increased labor costs. So $48 million is tied mainly to wage increases in FY 20. $33 million of the $48 million is cost increases tied to the agreement with CTU. $15 million of the 33 is for increased wages and benefits, due primarily to the incremental cost of the 3% COLAs. We have $11 million for a restructured wage scale for teaching assistants, nurses, and other school support staff. We have $5 million for substitute teacher incentives for hard-to-staff schools, pipeline initiatives for nurses, social workers, and case managers, and $2 million for FY 2020 class size reduction. $15 million of the $48 million is tied to costs in the SEIU tentative agreement. $2 million of this is related to the incremental cost of the 3% COLAs in FY 2020. And then an additional $13 million is related to the restructured wage scale and new stipends for our special education classroom assistants, security guards, custodians, and bus aides. In addition to the labor costs included in the FY 2020 amended budget, there's also two changes related to how we budget for support staff pensions. These are pensions for basically all non-teachers at CPS that are participants in the Municipal Employees Annuity and Benefit Fund. So the FY 2020 amended budget includes two updates, one of which is material and one of which is non-material to how we budget for this expense. The first, which is the material update, is that CPS is going to reimburse the city for $60 million related to the employer contribution to the pension fund. This is a payment that the city had made on behalf of CPS for a number of years that CPS is now reimbursing the city for. In the budget, it represents a reduction in revenue of $60 million. On top of that, CPS is budgeting a revenue and an expense of $138 million to reflect the additional payments made by the city to the pension fund. So these are dollars that do not hit our books It's not a cash transaction that we incur, but it's a portion of the budget intended to reflect the payment that the city makes on our behalf. It's a non-material update to the original budget. To better illustrate how the two portions of the support staff pension cost break out, we've put a math problem up on this slide. So what we see is that $60 million is the portion that is now covered by CPS. This was previously covered by the city, and this is what is reflected as a material update in the amended budget. On top of that, there's the $138 million, which is the estimated contribution that the city is making on behalf of CPS related to the unfunded liability in the MEABF. So when you total those two numbers together, you see there's an estimated cost of $198 million that reflects the total employer contribution to the fund. And then just to summarize, the amended budget includes $144 million of new operating revenues and expenses. So the amended budget is $7.84 billion and $6.32 billion in operating expenses. Just a walk down from where we started with the original budget approved in August to where we are now. The original budget included $6.175 billion of operating revenue and expense. And you'll see the different components of the update to the amended budget that we've discussed. So the increase in CTU cost adds $33 million in expense. The increase in SEIU cost adds $15 million in expense. The loss of the city subsidy for the MEABF is a loss of $60 million in revenue. And that's being offset by the increase in TIF funding that we're receiving from the city this year. In addition to those items, we're seeing a decreased expense of $68 million related to the days lost due to the strike. And there's an increase of $26 million to capture some short-term debt reduction. Those material changes total $6 million in additional revenue and $6 million of additional expense. And on top of that, we have an additional $138 million in revenue and expense related to the accounting treatment of the contribution of the city towards MEABF on our behalf. This has a net zero budget impact, and these items total $144 million that we're adding to the proposed amended budget. Take any questions?
Questions?
Hi, thanks, Mike. I'm sorry for missing the first session. I was teaching. But I have a question just about the MEABF and the way it's split up. So the 60 million and the 138 million, both of those are strictly for CPS workers, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, for both categories?
Yes.
Thank you.
Again, could you elaborate on the 138? That is not a cash transfer from the city, right?
That's correct.
It's an accounting procedure. Could you just say a little more about that?
Sure. So the $138 million is related to the payment that the city makes on behalf of CPS employees that's related to the unfunded liability in the MEABF. We never make a payment for that. We never receive the cash for that. But when the city makes that payment on our behalf, we treat it both as a revenue and an expense on our books. So in order to account for that, we have to have the budget authority to be able to record that expense.
But this is the first time we do that.
And this is yes.
But we will, after this year, continue to do that, right?
That is correct.
Okay. We don't know what the dollar amount will be?
So we do not yet know what the dollar amount will be in future years, but we expect it to grow as the city pays more into the MEABF.
Now, on the normal costs, the 60 million, after this year, there's no guarantee. We have an intergovernmental agreement, right, for this year to take in the 66 million, 60 of which go to cover these costs for the pensions, normal costs. But the following year, we don't know whether or not we'll get additional TIF dollars to cover that cost. Is that correct? But we
That-
will have to cover that cost.
That's
And
correct.
those are real dollars.
That's correct. Those are real dollars, and we're bringing a intergovernmental agreement to the November board meeting on the 20th to reflect 1 year of the of our commitment to reimburse the city for that expense on our behalf. This year, it is being offset by an increased level of TIF surplus revenue. The level of TIF surplus revenue in out years is something that'll be worked out.
It gets worked out on an annual basis.
Correct.
But there is the possibility that we could get additional dollars to cover
There's always that possibility.
that.
Yes.
You know, because in prior years, the 97 million that we have for TIF, that amount has been pretty consistent over the last 5 years, right?
That's correct. Going back to fiscal year 2016, CPS has received between roughly 90 and 100 million dollars in TIF surplus revenue each year.
Okay, so we're going to advocate for getting more. Good. Any other questions or comments?
Just to clarify on that point, Mike, the accounting treatment line, the amount may change, but will they always be exactly offsetting?
Yes, as long as the city's making that contribution on behalf of CPS, they will always be offsetting. We will both have a revenue and an expense that reflect that payment that the city's making.
And if the city isn't making that contribution for the underfunding, is CPS obligated to do so?
The city's required to make that payment by statute, so we're outside of the intergovernmental agreement. There's no obligation.
Got it.
on
Thank you.
CPS.
And the city is making that contribution for other sister agencies, right?
Correct. So the cost shift of the $60 million back to CPS reflects the city's arrangement with other sister agencies.
But on the unfunded liability portion, is the city making contributions on behalf of other sister agencies?
I believe that to be the case.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We can proceed to public participation.
Thank you, Mr. President. For the record, I would like to note that registration for the second FY20 amended budget public hearing was held between the hours of 5:30 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. Individuals who registered to speak will have 2 minutes to comment, and I will call the speakers in order of registration. The hearing will conclude after the last person who has signed in to speak has spoken, or at 8:30 p.m., whichever occurs first. When called, please state your name, and I will proceed by calling the first speaker. We only have 2, Mr. President. The first speaker will be Keith Keisel, followed by Pavlin Jenkov, please.
Good evening.
Good evening.
First of all, I'd like to say, I noticed that was told
Can you
that-
state your name for the record, please?
Keith Keisel. First of all, I'd like to say that in the media that came out on November 5th, it mentioned that this meeting would be not just for the budget, but for the calendar change days also. And then they told me when I came in here, this wasn't what it's for, but I do have copies of the different media releases that came out on November 5th stating we could come down here to voice our concern about the calendar change.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
And so we will accept your testimony on the calendar change. We will not be taking any action on that. That action will be taken at the November 20th meeting, but we'll accept your statement today.
Thank you. Okay, my name is Keith Keisel, and I have been a substitute teacher up until today when I started as a teacher's assistant. My concern about January 2nd and 3rd, before I took the position as a teacher assistant, I already had made just like many other teachers, I already had travel plans for January 2nd and 3rd. Not just for me, but the 2 kids that live in my house who also attend CPS schools. Now, I've heard through the grapevine, but nothing official, that they will, if you have proof of your travels, that you can take a personal day off. For me, I just people like me who may have just started with CPS, I have to understand I have to have 60 days before I even get a benefit day. What about for those who don't even have the availability to be able to take a personal day off if you have previous paid for travel plans on those dates? Also, my concern, what about the students who had previous travel plans for the day? Would they be counted as absent on that day? I mean, would there be an excused accident? Because nobody expected to have school on January 2nd and 3rd. Another concern is what kind of condition would the teachers be in on January 2nd, the day after Thanksgiving? So you may have a lot of teachers' absences. And then if we have a lot of students absent, how much money would the board, this is a budget hearing,
Mr. Keisel?
how much money, I can wrap it up. How much money would the schools lose if there's chronic absences on that day, which I predict that many students would not show up on school that day, and then a lot of funding is going to be lost because of the attendance rate on that day.
Thank you, Mr. Keisel.
Thank you for coming down. I appreciate it.
And the last speaker, Mr. President? Pavlin Jankov, please.
Hello, Pavlin Jankov, Chicago Teachers Union researcher. Glad to see some faces on this board. So I actually have some documents that I'd like to share. I think there's enough copies for everyone. So I'm either going to excite or disappoint some people. I want to talk about the pension shift at some length. I'll try to squeeze in my comments, and I'm glad to expand with the supplemental documents. So I want to just lay out a couple of facts as I understand them. So the city of Chicago has for decades made on-behalf payments for CPS to the annuity fund. This is a long-standing practice enshrined in statute. The on-behalf payments have been recorded as revenue in the other local revenues category of the budget book going back at least until 1998, when the accounting standards required that inclusion. If you look at the CAFRs, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports, those lay out in clear terms the funding structure of the annuity fund for CPS, and that structure, the language of that structure hasn't changed for 3 decades, at least going back as far back as 1983, which is the oldest document I've seen. And just quickly, that structure reads, CPS makes no direct contributions to the annuity fund, which receives its income from 3 primary sources: a City of Chicago tax levy, income from investments, and deductions from participating employees' salaries. And the document I provided has a copy of the relevant pages from the 1983, 1996, and 2009 CAFRs. More recent CAFRs are available on the board website, so obviously you have access to that. And the pension code also states clearly that the financing of the annuity fund be through taxes levied by the city council of the city. Second fact, I think we can all agree, CPS remains under-resourced. Prior to the annual budget cuts and student-based budgeting, we were about 160
Mr.
librarians. If I can just finish my point. So we're about 160 librarians shy of having every school staffed with librarian. Now we have hardly over 100. So I think we can all agree we need more resources in our schools. And the third thing, this is important, the city of Chicago has home rule authority. The Board of Education does not, right? So the increasing payments now faced by the city of Chicago for the annuity fund is due to the historic failure of the city to raise revenues necessary to make sufficient contributories. As a home rule municipality, the city of Chicago has both the responsibility and capacity to implement new progressive revenues to meet that statutory requirement. So, my questions for the board is, this does line up, this pension payment issue lines up also with what happened with the police payment. That was a payment that actually got bounced back and forth between the city and CPS. But when the city covered the cost, they said it's a recognition of its service to protect the schools just like they do any other part of the city system. And so between those two contracts, the $33 million for CPD and the $60 million fund, that's $100 million of resources, annual resources that are not going to be in the schools. So, to the board, how were you consulted about these issues? It's of real material relevance to the school district. And, given the circumstances, given where the capacities of the different municipal bodies lie in raising revenue, what is your stance on having these expenses now incumbent on the school district, which still has, a huge need for resources in our schools? Those are the issues I'd like some feedback on.
Thank you.
And Mr. President, that concludes the public comment segment.
Any other questions or comments from the board?
Nope.
Any questions or comments regarding public participation of the amended budget? If not, then this concludes the second FY20 amended budget hearing. Thank you.